Hi, I'm Kevin Morales with the Cayman Compass. I'm joined by Compass business editor Michael Klein. Michael, let's talk about financial services legislation. There were several bills that were discussed at the last sitting of the LA, and generally we've been talking about financial services legislation quite a bit over the last, maybe 2 years. What is this all about?
Well, in the past, we've seen a lot of financial services legislation that is really driven by commercial considerations, meaning, finding areas in the market where Cayman and Cayman service providers, Cayman entities can facilitate international transactions, whether it be in trade or in investment or in insurance. And over the past 2 years, we've still seen some tweaks to that, making sure that Cayman remains competitive. But for the most part, most financial services legislation has really come in response to international regulations, and there are several initiatives in that area. And the most important ones from Cayman perspective is really the CFATF review. The Caribbean Financial Action Task Force reviewed how Cayman tries to prevent money laundering and the financing of terrorism. And the other initiatives are in the tax space. So specifically the EU blacklist of countries and jurisdictions that it deems to be harmful or uncooperative in tax matters, and OECD initiatives around tax transparency, which really means the fight against tax evasion, and curbing the ability of multinational companies to shift profits across borders. That's really a fight against tax avoidance, which is seen as lowering tax revenues in developed countries. And all these initiatives have really put pressure on Cayman to amend its own laws and regulations.
So some of this, you could argue, might be detrimental to Cayman and its industry here locally. Does Cayman have to abide by these initiatives? And if so, why is non-compliance not an option?
Yeah, the problem is that being blacklisted by the EU, as Cayman is at the moment, or being blacklisted or listed by the Financial Action Task Force, really makes it more difficult to do business with the Cayman Islands and companies and funds that are based here. For example, it makes it more difficult to market Cayman funds to institutional investors in Europe, or it makes it more difficult for banks to send money to and from the Cayman Islands without carrying out additional due diligence, meaning additional checks, which of course means additional cost. So in short, there's a real threat that non-compliance would drive business away from Cayman.
And when we look at the bills that were presented recently in that last sitting of the LA, and we actually do have a couple more that I believe will be debated in the next sitting as well, which should be coming next week. When we look at the bills that were presented, what does that mean? What you're discussing, what does that mean? Why are these bills important? What do they have to do with these specific initiatives?
Yeah, obviously, if government engages with all these regulatory initiatives that are around, it really needs to determine what it needs to do, what regulatory changes are required. So in the last session of the LA, most of the bills really came in response to the CFATF review that criticized Cayman's anti-money laundering regime. In broad terms, it sort of said that Cayman does not understand all the risks faced by its entities, by all of its entities, in terms of money laundering. It criticized that not every profession was properly supervised for anti-money laundering purposes. For example, lawyers. It criticized that there were not enough investigations and prosecutions around money laundering. The report then made 63 recommendations, and what we're seeing at the moment is really the tail end of government going through all these recommendations line by line, figuring out what it needs to do to amend its own laws and the regulations to really follow that advice. All of that had to be carried out quite quickly because government is undergoing what's called a re-rating application process with the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. And had to submit a progress report. The Attorney General had to present a report really on government's progress in addressing these shortcomings. And we will see later this year whether that was successful and whether the FATF deems it sufficient, in terms of improving Cayman's anti-money laundering regime. What we specifically saw in the last session were a number of bills improving the way beneficial ownership information can be improved, the verification can be improved. It imposed certain sanctions on cases when information is requested but not forthcoming, for example. And all the legislation that we've seen is really making sure that supervisory authorities are in place for all aspects of business in the Cayman Islands, that they have sanctions, that they can impose fines on people who are not following the rules, who are not doing enough to fight money laundering. And so in general, really addressing all areas that are needed to have a proper money and anti-money laundering regime in place. We also saw in the last session of the LA, and it was interesting because it was actually something new, which was the Virtual Asset Service Providers Law, which is a law really establishing a framework for all companies operating in the crypto space.
Okay.
And what we could see here really is the effect of this international regulatory initiatives. Because on the one hand, Cayman wants to attract this type of business and wants to create a favorable environment for companies to operate in. And at the same time, it needs to comply with these initiatives and all the international regulations. And that's a real balancing act. And we could see that with this type of legislation for the first time, but it will in fact affect all kinds of other financial services legislation going forward.
Sure. And as we turn our attention to the sitting next week, what bills can we expect?
Was more of the same, really. We will see one bill, giving more power to CIMA for imposing administrative fines and defining the circumstances when it can disqualify certain directors. The most important change is to the Tax Information Authority law. Those changes will allow more collaboration between the Tax Information Authority and other government entities through appropriate legal channels. But it will also give new functions to the Tax Information Authority so that it can enforce and monitor the compliance with the Tax Information Authority law. That includes, for example, the power to investigate anybody's business with on-site inspections, with audits of annual returns and reports, and by collecting and sharing data. It also makes it an offense to knowingly provide false information to the Tax Information Authority, and that offense carries quite a hefty penalty of $10,000 and or 5 years in prison. But what once again drives all these changes to the laws is government's desire to demonstrate that Cayman is complying with international regulations, in this case with tax transparency efforts.
Right. Michael, really appreciate your time and breaking it all down for us. And we'll be sure to check out your kind of follow-ups throughout the week next week. Thanks so much for your time.